So this workshop 3 today, is titled Research on Technology and Practice Adoption in and for Integrating Biodiversity into Programs. And there's really quite a few projects among the shortlisted that are looking at adoption of practices or technology. So I think this will be absolutely relevant to our audience. Just a few words about Jo, or Josna Puri. She's a director of the Environment, Climate, Gender, Youth, Nutrition and Social Inclusion Division at IFAD. She leads the team that is responsible for evidence-informed advice on program design and implementation, contributing to resource mobilization and supporting IFAD's global remit in providing state-of-the-art policy advice related to these topics. Her division is also responsible for ensuring that IFAD's programs build in social, environmental and climate safeguards, while ensuring that IFAD's investments generate benefits in these areas. She has worked previously at the Green Climate Fund, 3RE, UNEP and the World Bank and UNDP. She's also a joint professor at Columbia University in New York, where she was also a research scientist. She has published in many academic journals and written for newspapers and provided advice as a board member to several development organizations. She has a PhD and an MSc in agriculture and resource economics, and an MA in development economics. And of course, she's an Indian national. Welcome, welcome, Jo, and thanks for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Francesco. So I don't know what the norm is in terms of this virtual classroom, but I'm going to ask to the extent that all of you can put on your videos. It might be nice to just see faces. So what I'm going to do is I've taken sort of the overall, thank you so much, Edito, and everyone else as you're coming on. Thanks. So what I'm going to do is I do have a few slides together, and I apologize that I sent the reading a little bit late. What I'm going to do is I do want to try and see if we can make it a bit interactive. And I know that the formal structure of the session is that I present some slides and then we have some Q&A. But I'm going to suggest, Francesco, if that's okay with you, that you also interrupt me. So put up your virtual hand if you can, and just let me know if you have questions. So I have about 8 or 9 slides. It's not a lot, but it's essentially to get you, you know, started on a journey of thinking that I know that you've been doing for this entire week. And with no pretensions at all that you're going to become the master of all of this, you know, in at least not in my session, but the idea is that we at least think together about a few things that are really critical in adoption of processes, in adoption of technologies, and then hopefully try and inspire some paradigms of thinking amongst all of you. So if that's okay, I'm going to share my screen okay, and just for brevity, what I have done is I've reduced the title. Can you see my slide? Someone say yes.
Yes, we can see your slide.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Yes.
So a lot of this is well, my slides are going to be informed by definitely the literature, but hopefully also by a lot of the practice, and perhaps also give you a little bit of an insight into what are the key things that are becoming really important as we learn more and more in the science of adoption, right? So I think, so if you look at the paper that I asked Francesco earlier today to essentially share with you, the paper really tries to focus on a couple of things that have been tried and tested in the biodiversity space, which is related to forestry. So whether this is joint forestry, whether this is community-based forestry, or other forms of management, there are a few things that the two authors essentially look at. Any quick response on which two countries the authors are looking at, if you have it? Anyone? Sorry, I can't look at your chat if you. Okay, thanks, Francesco, for sharing the paper. Very sweet.
No, we showed it earlier as well. But just to everyone, just use the chat, and I'll be happy to say whatever comes in the chat to you, Joe.
Okay, good. So essentially, it's really looking at different ways of managing forests, right? And what the authors identify as key areas that really, and then take away from looking at the experience of different studies, but also different sites in adopting new forms of managing forests, are that, and again, this is not rocket science, but there are three particular things that help to determine as to whether technology of any kind is really going to be adopted. So it's first, the characteristics of the innovation. Second, it's the characteristics of the adopter. And the third is the characteristics of the socioeconomic and the socio-ecological context within which you're working. And I was wondering if I'm going to take a minute to try and see if you had other things, all of you could think of other things that might affect technology adoption. Anyone?
Anyone, please use the chat. Resources?
So, yeah, go ahead.
So we have somebody, Alina from Ecuador saying resources, Wong Jiang from Vietnam saying the availability of technology, Jayanto from Philippines, access from infrastructure.
Excellent. Yeah, so exactly all of those things, yeah, the access to infrastructure, resources, availability of technology, all of those things are grouped in this paper around these 5 competing alternatives. Economic relevance, thanks for all of that. Access, absolutely right? So these are some of the things that are going to determine as to whether processes as well, and technology is not just about hard technology, right? So we are thinking also about new ways of doing things. And it's one of the things that really takes up a lot of my brain time, because even within institutions such as IFAD, or the International Fund for Agricultural Development, I'm constantly thinking about, okay, I've thought of something new. How do I get my team? But how do I get the rest of the institution to adopt new ways of doing things? And most institutions, societies, communities, people are inertial. This is just rule number 1 of most socio-ecological, socio-economic behavior change, that we tend to prefer inertia. That is no change to change, just because it's costless. And so really introducing and then getting people to adopt a technology, it does require a lot of different disciplines coming together. One of the interesting things that has been happening in the ecological literature, in the biodiversity literature, but also in the agricultural literature and the economics literature, is really thinking about how can we bring in insights from other disciplines that can help us to think about adoption. Now, a lot of you on chat mentioned a few things. There are a few other things as well. Peer effects, right? If your friend or your group of friends has adopted something, you're far more likely to adopt a technology or a process than not. In fact, this is seen in the farmer field schools. Farmer field schools where you could be teaching farmers to adopt, say, new agroecological practices so that you can conserve both your farm plot, but also the ecological characteristics of the land that you're cultivating, including the biodiversity content of them. But in farmer field schools, what you're trying to do is you're trying to create champions. So that champions who will be leaders and who will then go and work within their communities to also seed them with new ideas. But of course, the challenge always is, if I'm the champion, either I could convert you or you could convert me back, right? So it's really important to choose those champions with care. But the key underlying idea is that you're creating a community of people who are also going to support you, but will also encourage you to adopt that new technology, especially if they have adopted it already. And this peer effect or the network effect is really critical and something that we need to recognize, but has also been the mainstay of a lot of the interventions that are done that are meant to inspire stakeholders on the ground in developing countries, but also in developed countries, to change behavior with respect to biodiversity, with respect to agriculture. And so in this paper, actually, the authors refer to a Rogers paper, which is a 2003 paper, but actually Rogers' adoption work actually goes to the 1960s. And they refer to the S-curve, yeah? And this is a very bad sort of representation of the S-curve, but imagine, if you will, truly an S. Yeah, so I tried to do that with whatever PowerPoint will let me do. But essentially, this is pretty classic in technology adoption, that you have an S-curve of adoption. And really the story to be told here is that most technologies, and I really encourage you to take a look at the paper. It's a very easy read, very quick, but it gives you a very quick synopsis of what has happened in terms of understanding adoption of technologies. And if, bilaterally, if you wanted to be in touch, and I can also give you lots of other papers on technology adoption, but I wanted to choose something that could be short, snippy, but give you a pretty good idea of what are the things that you should be concerned about when you're thinking about technology adoption. And so if you follow my mouse on your screen, most technologies go through this, value of death period. Either you stay here at a low level equilibrium, technologies get introduced irrespective of whether they are useful, whether there are peer effects, whether it's going to be personally or privately useful. A lot of technologies stay at the low part of this S-curve. Yeah. Now, if you manage to get past it and create some connections, peer effects, etc., the key thing to watch for most technologies, new processes, new ideas, is really to see as to whether they will reach what is called here the inflection point. Sorry, I should have said this. So the two axes represent, first is how much is adopted in your target group. What is the percentage of people that are adopting that process or technology or behavior or way of doing things? And this is true for biodiversity as much as it is true in most other things, and that's what the authors discuss as well. And then on the y-axis, on the x-axis, you have time. So over time, this is what you're going to see. And of course, the other part of, and this is another reason I chose the paper, the other part of seeing this S-curve in technology or idea adoption is the Facebook effect, right? Things just go viral. And maybe generation, Facebook has come to expect that, yes, new ideas will go viral almost instantly, but that's almost never true. I mean, this is the internet, the Facebook, all of these things are very different from regular technology adoption phenomena, which usually follow this idea. And even Facebook, even the internet, went through its own version of the S-curve. That is, you need a critical mass of people to adopt it. You reach your inflection point, and then you have your takeoff. Yeah, and that takeoff then is essentially saying that you've reached another paradigm. And for most people, this change in paradigm is really the holy grail. You want to get to, really seeing that just about everybody has moved into this new level of adoption. Yeah. So I want to then go on to this other idea of changing the paradigm. Changing the paradigm has become basically the holy grail, like I said, in most adoption literature, and most institutions will aim to sort of say, okay, yes, we are good. We want to see, technology adoption or behavior adoption, etc., so that we can see some impact. But really, large-scale impact is going to come about when you shifted the paradigm completely and you've led to, essentially a changing of the worldview. Paradigm shifts are therefore becoming the important thing that most organizations will change. And it comes from the concept of paradigm shift, which is not mentioned in the paper, and which is why I thought I would introduce it to you. It comes from a very classic 1960s paper, which is titled the scientific revolution. How are the characteristics? So the characteristics of scientific revolutions, and it's by Thomas Kuhn. So Thomas Kuhn essentially said that, look, paradigm shifts or big changes in adoption or in new practices will occur, which will characterize what's called a paradigm shift, but they need certain characteristics for them to be illustrated or for them to be realized. I beg your pardon. I want to use one example of a paradigm shift, which is outside of biodiversity. But in biodiversity, you know, for example, protected areas, use of protected areas, use of joint forestry mechanisms and management systems, agroecological systems, climate smart agriculture, all of these are pretty good ideas of what is happening in biodiversity, but we haven't yet witnessed a paradigm shift there. And so I wanted to take sort of an example from the medical literature to try and give you an idea of what a paradigm shift could look like. And here I'm using the example of the Cochrane. Cochrane Collaboration is an organization in medicine that essentially systematically puts together evidence to say whether something is working or not. You would find it surprising, but even in medicine, it's not as if you show one study or one trial that has shown for a medicine or a procedure to be successful. Even if one study shows a medicine or a procedure to be successful, it does not mean that doctors completely overhaul their practices, right? You need consistent, systematic evidence coming out to essentially say that, yes, you should change your practice or you should change your diagnosis. And this is the case of what we're seeing basically with corticosteroids. Corticosteroids, so it was witnessed that a lot of women who gave birth early tended to also die because of premature births. And a lot of doctors experimented with a lot of different types of medicines to understand as to what would work. So this is essentially the example of what is called a forest plot. A forest plot says, okay, and each one of these lines is a separate study which is showing you as to whether the medicine, in this case corticosteroids, are working or not. So I'm moving my cursor on the left-hand side of your screen, and I'm basically looking at these dashed lines across the vertical line, right? So each one of these seven lines is a separate study. And I won't go into what is a forest plot, but I do want to say that it was really important for study after study to show that corticosteroids were actually reducing the risk of death from early birth of mothers before it became standard practice in medicine for doctors to then indicate that corticosteroids should be prescribed to women who are far more likely to give birth early to their babies. And that helped to reduce early birth deaths by 50%. But the point is that the practice changed only after you had a critical accumulation of evidence with respect to success. How am I doing in terms of time, Francesco?
I don't know, 2 more minutes?
2 more minutes? Wow. Okay. So then I basically, so this is the idea of, accumulating evidence. And I think it's really important for us to think about what is this evidence that we accumulate in terms of success before we can think about changing paradigms with respect to adoption. Okay, some other thoughts on adoption. in a lot of, and biodiversity is definitely, if you look at the Partha Gupta Biodiversity Review, and I'm really going to encourage you all and urge you all to look at this wonderful treatise on biodiversity, which came about 2 months ago and which was published by the government of the UK, where Partha Gupta essentially put together all of the evidence that we do have in terms of how biodiversity can and will change the paradigm on in this world globally in terms of our own practices. They also talked about how there are some things that we know are good for us, but do not change our practices. And I want to spend 1 minute introducing this idea of behavioral science before I close. We can have a lot of evidence on what is working, what is not, why, for whom, and how much. But that's not sufficient. And we know this because we know that people continue to eat a lot. Obesity is a big problem. Drug abuse is a big problem. Alcoholism, smoking, they all have really good evidence about why you should not be indulging in some practices, but people don't change their behavior. And this is very much true in the biodiversity literature. You can keep telling people that it's really good for them, for their farms, that they will have more profit, that biodiversity is good for them. People don't change behavior. And this is why I want to just quickly tease you with this idea of behavioral science, which is now the new kid on the block. If you've read the literature by Richard Thaler, who's a Nobel Prize winner, Kahneman and Tversky, they are all working on confronting our biases and encouraging the use of psychology in our own studies. And that is really recognizing that human beings are not Spock-like, very rational, using evidence, etc. Rather, we are very, very lazy people. And we are like the Bart Simpsons of the world. We just want to sit on our sofas, and we essentially want to do, the things that we're continuing to do with minimal effort. So we are not the Spocks of the world. We are the Bart Simpsons of the world. Yeah. And if we confront that, then we have to confront the fact that, look, there are so many biases that will affect as to whether we adopt new forms of technology, processes, and behavior. And these are only a list of, 2, 3 out of, I can give you a list of at least 15 biases that are always there, even amongst economists. And I'm an economist, so I can take the joke, right? So an economist, for example, will continue to tell everyone else that, oh, you should not suffer from confirmation bias. That is, just because you think that just because you believe in something, you look for that particular piece of evidence. That's confirmation bias. Sunk cost bias is essentially if you put in a lot of effort or money into something, even if you know it's not going to work, you continue to do the same thing. And this happens with a lot of people who are tending to biodiversity. And the last example is the effect of framing. The way your message gets framed also then affects as to whether you would adopt, the technology or behavior or not. These are biases that even economists have. And in a controversial study at the World Bank as well as at DFID, there was a very nice study that showed that people who are economists all suffered systematically from these biases. So I'm going to stop here and see if you have questions, and we can hopefully have a little bit of a discussion. Thanks very much, Francesco, and over to you.
Thank you, Joe. We have 5 minutes, but if anybody has questions, please use the chat or unmute yourself and go ahead. Our first question, maybe for you, Joe. I'll put it for myself. Now, a lot of the studies, of course, are trying, the projects that are running for the awards are trying to look at technology adoption and practice change, so basically behavioral change at some level. But, I think they're also trying to look at the larger framework, the policy framework, the institutional sides that basically create incentives and disincentives to specific action, where it's about the cost of fertilizers, right? That compete with basically competing basically good arguments, whether in economic terms or in more normative terms about choices that people make. How do you fit? How does behavioral science kind of fit within this broader analysis of basically systems? Right, and what influences people's actions and collective actions in particular?
Okay, in your question, there are three questions, because first you talked about fertilizer and the cost of fertilizer, which is not a systems issue. It's essentially a pricing issue, right? If as a farmer, I'm going to look at 2 bags of fertilizers and they have different costs, what are the choices I make? But then you also asked me the question about behavioral science and how that comes into play in a systems framework. And I'm happy to answer both questions, but just to say that they're 2 very different questions, Francesca. I hope that's okay. So I think on the first one, it's fairly clear that, yeah, at the margin, we all are, going to be doing sort of the budgets in our households, and we are all going to think about, well, fertilizer A versus fertilizer B, which one should I buy? And provided both fertilizers are as efficacious, I might choose, but cost is not the only driving factor. And I think this is really important for us to understand. Cost is not the only driving factor. I will go and drink a Coke over a Pepsi any day, irrespective of cost of the Coke of can over Pepsi. And this is true for, because tastes are primitive. Yeah, people do not, and households do not adopt, for example, efficient cook stoves because there are some other things that are primitive to us, how food tastes, that will essentially keep us away from efficient cook stoves, irrespective of the indoor air pollution benefits or disbenefits that you will argue to me. Yes. So cost is only one part of the overall decision framework. And I think maybe that's what you're alluding to.
No, I think this stresses the point that has been made during the past days as well. But you need to look at the issues from from multiple perspectives, disciplinary perspectives. Now, in order to actually get a good pictures of what's going on. So looking at prices alone from an economic point of view won't help. But there's a question, a very relevant question, because a lot of the projects are looking at practice change and technology adoption, but the grants we are going to give out are 2-year grants and relatively small ones, $40,000. So what is it, can you say anything as a last comment, I think, because we won't have much time, about the time frame of the paradigm change that you talk about?
So in 2 years, unless I would have really liked to have known a little bit more about the kind of technologies or things that you were trying to experiment. But I think if you've got 2 years and if you're really trying to understand diffusion, I would really focus on trying to test, first designing as to how you would frame, cost, and introduce nudges for behavior change, and testing those to see whether those are going to work or not. And then, figuring out as to whether there are some strategies that have been piloted and that can work. And then scaling up the ones that can work. So my own emphasis would be to try, in shorter term grants, and depending very much on what the overall innovation is, I would try and design, test, and then scale. I'm not sure that you're going to be thinking about completely scaled up interventions at this time, but the design, test, scale formula usually works for me.
Excellent, and I think here the key message is that basically looking at technology adoption and practice adoption is not an add-on to something else, particularly for projects that are small and that are like short-term, but there's a whole kind of gigantic literature and a lot of methodological debates on how to study behavioral change and the introduction of specific technology and practices, new technology and practices. So the message, I guess, for those of you looking at technology adoption is to think in terms of how much space do you have in your research project for looking at technology adoption. So thanks a lot, Jo, for coming on board. And yes, we will move on to the 4th workshop of the day. If there's any other question coming in, we'll make sure that they reach you.
Let me know. Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks, Francesco, for the opportunity. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you, Jo.